Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another edition of History and Truth. Today, we are once again in Ogimon, a 250-year-old cafe in Hirado, Nagasaki Prefecture, Japan, having coffee out of a 250-year-old coffee cup and sitting beside a map of the world in 1700. Today, our subject is Father Le Loutre's War from 1749 to 1755. It's also known as the Indian War, the Mi'kmaq War, and the Anglo-Mi'kmaq War. It took place between King George's War, which was from May 1744 to October 1748, and the French and Indian War, which took place from May 1754 to October 1763. And Acadia was all of this, and Nova Scotia was just the mainland, the peninsular part of Nova Scotia at the time, on one side of the conflict. The British and New England colonists were led by British officer Charles Lawrence and New England Ranger John Gorham, who I don't have a picture of, but I do have the records of his unit. Gorham's Rangers was active from 1744 to 1762. They were provincial troops, rangers, and mostly made up of Mohawk and other natives from the Massachusetts and area around there. Their garrison headquarters was in Annapolis Royal from 1744 to 1749, and Halifax from 1749 to 1762. They only had one company. A company at this time was between 64 and 78 soldiers. They were engaged in King George's War, Father Le Loutre's War, and the French and Indian Wars. Here are all the campaigns they were involved in. They were also the beginnings of the American Rangers. On the other side was Father Jean-Louis Le Loutre and the Acadian militia and the Mi'kmaq, who engaged in guerrilla warfare against Protestant settlers and British forces. At the outbreak of the war, there was an estimated 2,500 Mi'kmaq and 12,000 Acadians in the region. A good look, they were well armed, steel knives, steel hatchets, and muskets that were generally better quality than what the British Army soldiers were using. Far better flints in the flintlock muskets. When the British captured Port Royal in 1710 and were ceded Peninsular Acadia in 1713 in a war called Queen Anne's War, which was from March 1702 to July 1713. The Mi'kmaq and Acadians continued to contain the British in settlements at Port Royal and Canso. The rest of the colony was in the control of the Catholic Mi'kmaq and Indians. This Catholicism is going to be important once the war gets going. About 40 years later, the British made a concerted effort to settle Protestants in the region and to establish military control over all of Nova Scotia and what became present-day New Brunswick, igniting armed response from Acadians and Father Le Loutre's War. The British settled 3,229 people in Halifax during the first years. This exceeded the number of Mi'kmaq in the entire region and was seen as a threat to the traditional occupiers of the land. That would have been the Wabanaki Confederacy. The Wabanaki Confederacy included the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Abenaki, and another small group in here. Penobscot, probably. They spoke Abenaki, Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq, Sink, and also English and French. The Mi'kmaq and some Acadians resisted the arrival of these Protestant settlers. The war caused unprecedented upheaval in the area. Atlantic Canada witnessed more population movements, more fortification construction, and more troop allocations than ever before. 24 conflicts were recorded during the war, battles, raids, and skirmishes, 13 of which were Mi'kmaq and Acadian raids on the capital region, Halifax, Dartmouth. As typical of frontier warfare, many additional conflicts were unrecorded. During Father Le Loutre's war, the British attempted to establish firm control of the major Acadian settlements in Peninsula Nova Scotia and to extend the control to the disputed territory of present-day New Brunswick. This was done through a series of blockhouses. This is what a blockhouse would look like. This blockhouse is the one currently in Fort Edward, Nova Scotia, the oldest still existing blockhouse in North America. This, once again, is Peninsular Nova Scotia. Okay. The British also wanted to establish Protestant communities in Nova Scotia. During the war, the Acadians and Mi'kmaq left Nova Scotia for the French colonies of Ile Saint-Jean, which is now Prince Edward Island, and Ile Royale, which is Cape Breton Island. Again, Ile Saint-Jean is Prince Edward Island. Ile Royale is Cape Breton Island. The French also tried to maintain control of the disputed territory of present-day New Brunswick. Father Le Loutre tried to prevent the New Englanders from moving into present-day New Brunswick just as a generation earlier during Father Rail's War. Father Rail's War is also known as Dummer's War, and it was mostly happening in the American colonies. It was from 25th July 1722 to 15th September 1725. In Dummer's War, supply of steel, axes, knives, and better muskets became fully established through Father Rail. Rail had tried to prevent New Englanders from taking over present-day Maine. Throughout the war, the Mi'kmaq and Acadians attacked the British forts in Nova Scotia and the newly established Protestant settlements. They wanted to retard or slow down British settlement and buy time for France to implement its Acadian resettlement scheme. The war began with the British establishing Halifax, settling more British settlers within 6 months than there were Mi'kmaq. In response, the Acadians and Mi'kmaq orchestrated attacks at Chignecto, Grand Pre, Dartmouth, Canso, Halifax, and Country Harbor. The French erected forts at present-day Fort Menegouche, which is St. John, Fort Beausejour at the border, and Fort Gaspereau, which is across the way, cutting off the other side to the border. The British responded by attacking the Mi'kmaq and Acadians at Mirlegouche, also later known as Lunenburg, Chignecto, and St. Croix by Nova Scotia pronunciation. The British unilaterally established communities in Lunenburg and Lawrencetown. Finally, the British erected forts in Acadian communities located at Windsor, Grand Pre, and Chignecto. The war ended after 6 years with the defeat of the Mi'kmaq, Acadians, and French in the Battle of Fort Beausejour. Background: Acadian resistance to British rule in Acadia began after Queen Anne's War, with the signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1713. The treaty saw the French cede portions of New France to the British, including the Hudson Bay region, Newfoundland, and peninsular Acadia. So, more than this. Acadians had previously supported the French in 3 conflicts known as the French and Indian Wars. Acadians joined French privateer Pierre Maisonnat de Baptiste as crew members in his victories over many British vessels during King William's War, once again proving that the Acadians were not necessarily peaceful people. Some were pirates. After the siege of Pemaquid, Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville led a force of 124 Quebecois, Acadians, Mi'kmaq, and Abenaki in the Avalon Peninsula campaign. They destroyed almost every British settlement in Newfoundland, killed more than 100 British, captured many more. They deported almost 500 British colonists to England or France. So the first people to start deporting were the French. This is an image of the evacuation of French forces from Port Royal. The French ceded the Acadian Peninsula to the British after the siege of Port Royal in 1710. During Queen Anne's War, Mi'kmaq and Acadians resisted during the raid on Grand Pre. Pisiquid and Chignecto in 1704. This was in response to the Wabanaki Mi'kmaq raid on Deerfield in 1704. This raid, once again, was not so much to destroy land or destroy property, although it did. It was more to get back enough hostages to trade back for the hostages that the Mi'kmaq took from the English at Deerfield. It was a trade-off. Here is an image of the Deerfield massacre. The Acadians assisted the French in protecting the capital in the first siege of Port Royal and the final second siege of Port Royal. However, with the signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1713, Peninsular Acadia was formally ceded to the British. Although peace was formally established in France, the British still faced resistance from the French colonists in the Acadian Peninsula. During Father Rail's War, the Malicete raided numerous British vessels on the Bay of Fundy, while the Mi'kmaq raided Canso in 1723. In the latter engagement, the Mi'kmaq were supported by the Acadians. During these conflicts, the French and Acadian settlers were aligned with the Mi'kmaq, fighting alongside them during the Battle of Bloody Creek, which is just outside of Fort Anne, which was on the way down the Annapolis Valley, but not very far, where 18 British soldiers were killed in an ambush. Here is an image of the story of King Philip's War, which was happening in New England from 1675 to 1678. And here we have a typical native attack on an English settlement. The Mi'kmaq, which formed a part of the Wabanaki Confederacy, had a long history of conflict with encroaching British settlers in the New England Acadia frontier in Maine during the 17th and 18th century. The Wabanaki fought in several campaigns, including in 1688 and King Philip's War, 1703, 1723, 1724, 1745, 1746, and in 1747. Here is an image of Acadian and Mi'kmaq militias fighting together alongside each other, alongside French forces during the Battle of Grand Pre in 1747, once again proving that neither the Acadians nor the Mi'kmaq were peaceful. Hostilities between the British and French resumed during King George's War from 1744 to 1748. Supported by the French, Jean-Louis Le Loutre, this guy again, led French soldiers, Acadian militias, and Mi'kmaq forces in efforts to recapture the capital, such as the siege of Annapolis Royal. There were actually many attacks. During the siege, the French officer Marin had taken British prisoners and stopped with them further up the bay at Cobequid. While at Cobequid, an Acadian said the French soldiers should have left the British carcasses behind and brought their skins. Le Loutre was also joined by the prominent Acadian resistance leader Joseph Broussard, also known as Beausoleil. Broussard and other Acadians supported the French soldiers in the Battle of Grand Pre. Here's information on Joseph Broussard. He was born 1702, died 1765. He was a captain of the Acadian militia who, by Nova Scotian poor education systems, says didn't have a militia. Oh, yes, he did, obviously. And he was involved with Father Rail's War, Siege of Annapolis Royal, King George's War, Battle of Grand Pre, Father Loutre's War, Battle at Chignecto, raids on Dartmouth, raids on Lawrencetown, the French and Indian War, the Battle of Beausejour, Battle of Bloody Creek in 1757, and the Battle of Restigouche. Finally, he would lead the Acadians to Louisiana, militia captain of the Acadians at the Attakapas. He also led Acadians into New Brunswick. During King George's War, which is also known as the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe, Le Loutre, Gorham, and Lawrence rose to prominence in the region. During the war, however, Massachusetts Governor Shirley acknowledged that Nova Scotia was still scarcely British and urged London to fund building forts in the Acadian communities. The signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 ended formal hostilities between British and French forces. With peace formally re-established, the British began to consolidate its control over Peninsula Acadia, leading further conflict with the Acadian and Mi'kmaq, with Acadians and Mi'kmaq. A point to say here is that Father Le Loutre was the main instigator of all the conflict at this time. Le Loutre had threatened excommunication to all Native and Acadians if they didn't fight the English. And seeing as they were all Catholic, this was quite a threat. He also offered 1,000 sols per English scalp, this part. Now, English scalp meaning Anglophone scalp, as there were early English Nova Scotians living in Annapolis Royal at this time, as well as the early settlers of Halifax, Dartmouth, Lunenburg, Lawrencetown, and Windsor. At the outset of Le Loutre's War, along with the New England Ranger units, there were 3 British regiments in Halifax. The 40th Regiment of Foot, who looked like this, arrived from Annapolis. The 40th Regiment of Foot was actually formed in 1717 in Annapolis Royal and was first called Phillips Regiment after Lieutenant General Peregrine LaSalle's commander after Commander Phillips. It was half raised in South Lancashire and Somerset in particular in England, and the other half was raised by local English settlers in the Annapolis Royal area, meaning that it was the first Anglophone army unit in Canada. So here's the 40th. More of the 40th, 2nd Somersetshire Regiment of Foot. It was active from 1717 to 1881 and became the South Lancashire Regiment and now part of the Lancaster Regiment, Duke of Lancaster's Regiment. So they were line infantry, and there was 1 battalion at beginning, but 2 battalions from 1799 to 1802 and from 1804 to 1816. Its garrison headquarters was Peninsular Barracks in Warrington, but originally Fort Anne in Annapolis Royal. Another unit there was the 29th Regiment of Foot, which was also known as Peregrine Hobson's Regiment. The 49th Regiment of Foot was active from 1694 to 1698 and from 1702 to 1881. Their headquarters was in Norton Barracks, Worcestershire. Their nicknames: the Two and Hook, the Ever-Sworded 29th, the Vein Openers, and the Guards of the Line. The red uniforms had yellow facings. So that's the 29th. And the 45th Regiment of Foot, which was Hugh Warburton's regiment, which arrived from Louisbourg. The 45th Nottinghamshire or Sherwood Foresters Regiment of Foot was active from 1741 to 1881. And it was line infantry, of course, and its garrison headquarters was Glenparva Barracks in Leicestershire. Its nickname was the Old Stubborns. At sea, Captain John Roos. Okay, there's more about the 47th here. That's the same thing, 1741 to 1881, 1741 to 1800. And again, from 1801 to 1881. More of the information of that regiment. At sea, Captain John Roos was the senior naval officer of the Nova Scotian station during the war. The main officer under his command was Sylvanus Cobb. John Gorham also owned 2 armed schooners, the Anson and the Warren. There's another image of 47th Regiment of Foot and a look at one of the commanders, very important in Nova Scotian history, Captain Murray. Here is a collection of the soldiers of the uniforms of the 3 regiments based in Nova Scotia. The course of the war, 1749. British consolidation in Nova Scotia. Here is a soldier of the 29th Regiment of Foot guarding Halifax against raids by Acadian and Mi'kmaq militia. This is 1749. Horseman's Fort, here, stands in the background. The war began when Edward Cornwallis arrived to establish Halifax with 13 transports in June 21st, 1749. With that group were settlers from who came from the slums and poor people of England as well as Scotland. The pacification of the Highlands, Cornwallis allowed for the few Scottish people that he could save to become indentured servants and sent to Halifax to be part of the original settlers. So he was not the monster of the Highland clearances. He was the guy who was trying to save people from being massacred in the Highlands. The British quickly began to build other settlements to guard against the Mi'kmaq, Acadian, and French attacks on the new Protestant settlements. British fortifications were erected in Halifax Citadel, once again here, in 1749. Bedford, which is Fort Sackville, is a four-corner star fort. And Dartmouth, which was Horseman's Fort we already took a look at. Lunenburg in 1753, and Lawrencetown. This is once again Fort Sackville. Lawrencetown was further down the coast past Cole Harbor in Halifax County. Within 18 months of establishing Halifax, the British attempted to take control of the Nova Scotia Peninsula by building fortifications, as we already said, in all the major Acadian communities: present-day Windsor, Fort Edward, Grand Pre, here's the Battle of Grand Pre, and here's Fort Vaux-Logis. And Chignecto, Fort Lawrence. Fort Lawrence was here. Fort Beausejour was at this time called Fort Beaubassin. Beausejour was built almost on top of Beaubassin. Here's Fort Lawrence facing it. A British fort, Fort Anne, already existed in the other major Acadian center of Annapolis Royal. Here. And Quebec remained without a fort. Le Loutre is reported to have said that the English might build as many forts as they pleased, but he would take care that they should not come out of them, for he was resolved to torment them with his Indians. In fact, Mi'kmaq resistance kept the British largely holed up in their forts until the fall of Louisbourg in 1758, which makes a complete lie of the bizarre statement that the English were running around scalping Mi'kmaq. They were terrified to leave the force most of the time. This is Richard Buckley. The lieutenant governors of Nova Scotia noted that Nova Scotia was kept in an uninterrupted state of war by the Acadians. By June 1751, Cornwallis wrote to the Board of Trade that his adversaries had done as much harm as they could have done in open war. Richard Buckley, this guy, wrote that between 1749 and 1755, Nova Scotia was kept in an uninterrupted state of war by the Acadians. And the reports of an officer commanding at Fort Edward, here's Fort Edward again, indicated that he could not be conveyed to Halifax with less than an escort than an officer and 30 men. Along with Buckley, Cornwallis and other aide-de-camp was Horatio Gates. Here is Fort Edward in 1900. The blockhouse, the barracks, and the officers' building is still existing there. The only land route between Louisbourg and Quebec went from Baie Verte through Chignecto along the Bay of Fundy and up the St. John River. With the establishment of Halifax, the French recognized at once the threat it represented and that the St. John River corridor might be used to attack Quebec City itself. To protect this vital gateway, at the beginning of 1749, the French strategically constructed, oh, here we go again, back to the map. This is the route they're talking about. Here is the area we're talking now about. The French strategically constructed 3 forts within 18 months along the route, one at Baie Verte, Fort Gaspereau. Here's the narrow point between mainland Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Here is the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and here's the Bay of Fundy. Fort Gaspereau is here. Fort Beausejour is here. Originally it would be called Beaubassin. And across from them is Fort Lawrence in opposition. And there's another one at the mouth of the St. John River, which was called Menagouche at this time. It would later become St. John. In response to Gorham's raid on the St. John River in 1748, the Governor of Canada threatened to support native raids along the northern New England border. There were many previous raids from Mi'kmaq militia and Malecite militias against the British settlers on the border. In 1703, 1723, 1724, 1745, 1746, and 1747. During the war along the former border of Acadia, the Kennebec River, the British built Fort Halifax, Winslow, Fort Shirley at Dresden, formerly Frankfort, and Fort Western, August. This would be the border areas of Maine. Here is an image of Fort Gaspereau area today. This is now close to the ferry terminal at Port Elgin. Here's an image of an early American settler in a fight with a native. Here's a map of the area at the time. As you can see, there's not many towns and villages yet. It's quite sparsely populated. And here again is another image of Fort Beausejour. Okay. The Acadian Exodus. Once again, we have this guy, Father Jean-Louis Le Loutre, who led the Acadian Exodus, an event that saw half of the Acadian population in the Acadian Peninsula relocate to French-controlled territories further inland, New Brunswick. With demands for an unconditional oath, the British fortification of Nova Scotia, and the support of French policy, a significant number of Acadians made a stand against the British. On 18th September 1749, a document was delivered to Edward Cornwallis, signed by a total of 1,000 Acadians, with representatives from all the major centers. The document stated that they would leave the country before they would sign an unconditional oath. Cornwallis continued to press the unconditional oath, rejecting their Christian Catholic faith and accepting the Protestant Anglican Church, with a deadline of 25th October. Remember, there was the extra aspect to this. Within the Catholic system, Le Loutre was threatening excommunication to any Acadian or Mi'kmaq who would not fight the British. So this was actually more than just religion. In response, hundreds of Acadians were deported by the British with the confiscation of their homes, their lands, and their cattle. The deportation of the Acadians by the British involved almost half of the total Acadian population of Nova Scotia. The expulsion was brutal, often separating children from their families. The leader of the exodus was Father Jean-Louis Le Loutre, this guy again, whom the British gave the code name Moses. Historian Michelin Johnson described Le Loutre as the soul of the Acadian resistance. He was more than that. He was the monster who gave the orders for all the scalpings, murder, and attacks on English-speaking settlers. The conflict begins. The first Mi'kmaq breach of the Treaty of 1726 and 1748 was at Canso. On 19 August 1749, Lieutenant Joseph Gorham, younger brother of John Gorham, military officer, was under the command of William Clapham at Canso, and his party was attacked by Mi'kmaq. It was also attacked in 1725-26, which was a violation of the Treaty of Utrecht. Here's another look at Canso, Fort Canso, which was actually called Fort William Augustus. So in 1748, in August 1749, they seized his vessel and took 20 prisoners and carried them off to Louisbourg 10 days later on the 29th. After Cornwallis complained to the governor of Ile Royale, 16 of the prisoners were released to Halifax and the other 4 sent off on their own vessel. The year earlier, the Mi'kmaq had seized Captain Ellingwood's vessel, Success, and he promised them £100 and left his son hostage to have it released. Mi'kmaq reported that they released the prisoners from Canso because Captain Ebenezer Ellingwood had paid the money but had not returned for his son. At the Isthmus of Chignecto on August 1749, the Mi'kmaq attacked 2 British vessels thought to be preventing Acadians from joining the Acadian exodus by leaving Beaubassin for Ile Saint-Jean. On September 18th, several Mi'kmaq and Malicites ambushed and killed 3 British men at Chignecto. 7 natives were killed in the skirmish. Here is an image of the violence of such skirmishes. On 24th September 1749, the Mi'kmaq formally wrote to Governor Cornwallis through French missionary Father Maillard, proclaiming their ownership of the land and expressing their opposition to British actions in settling in Halifax. Some historians have read this letter as a declaration of hostility against the British. Other historians have questioned that interpretation. It was obviously a declaration of war as through the Treaty of 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht, and later deal of 1726. The mainland of Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq had already agreed to be surrendering and part of the English mainland Nova Scotia. On September 30th, 1749, about 40 Mi'kmaq attacked 6 men during the raid on Dartmouth. This is the plaque at the site today. The raid on Dartmouth, 1749, and there was a blockhouse there built in response in 1750. This is at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum. Skip forward. The raid on Dartmouth in 1749 occurred during Father Le Loutre's War. On September 30th, 1749, when a Mi'kmaq militia from Chignecto raided Major Ezekiel Gilman's sawmill. Here's Gilman's or Gilmut's sawmill. Dartmouth was just a bunch of trees then, more or less. Here is Warren's Point, and the sawmill would have been here. At present-day Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, killing 4 workers and wounding 2. This raid was one of 7 the Wabanaki Confederacy and Acadians would conduct against the settlement during the war. Historical context. Despite the British conquest of Acadia in 1710, Nova Scotia remained primarily occupied by Catholic Acadians and Mi'kmaq, meaning they were subject to excommunication if they didn't fight. Father Loutre's war began when Edward Cornwallis arrived to establish Halifax with 13 transports on June 21st, 1749. By the time Cornwallis had arrived in Halifax, there was a long history of the Wabanaki Confederacy, which included the Mi'kmaq, killing British civilians along the New England and Acadia border in Maine. In the campaigns in 1688, 1703, 1723, 1724, 1745, 1746, and 1747. After establishing an initial settlement in Halifax in the summer of 1749, it was imperative that Governor Edward Cornwallis make peace with the native peoples of the province before further colonization could proceed. On 15th August, Governor Cornwallis and members of his council met with representatives of the Penobscot, Narradichwalk, St. John, Cape Sable, and other tribes aboard HMS Beaufort in Halifax Harbor. They agreed to sign a redrafted treaty of 1752 that would be ratified at a later date. Obviously, they didn't mean to keep the treaty. Governor Cornwallis was informed in August that 2 vessels were attacked by the Indians at Canso, whereby 3 English and 7 Indians were killed. Council believed the attack had been orchestrated by Abbe Le Loutre. Father Le Loutre again. Prior to this incident, the priest had written the following to the Minister Marine de la France. As we cannot openly expose to the English ventures, I think that we cannot do better than to incite the Indians to continue warring on the English. My plan is to persuade the Indians to send word to the English that they will not permit new settlements to be made in Acadia. I shall do my best to make it look to the English as if this plan comes from the Indians, and that I have no part in it. To guard against the Mi'kmaq, Acadian, and French attacks on the new Protestant settlements, British fortifications were erected in Halifax in 1749, Bedford, Fort Sackville, in 1749, Dartmouth in 1750, Lunenburg in 1753, and Lawrencetown, Halifax County, in 1754. On 24th September 1749, the Mi'kmaq formally wrote to Governor Cornwallis through Father Maillard, proclaiming their ownership of the land and expressing their opposition to the British actions in settling at Halifax. Okay, now on to the raid. Major Ezekiel Gilliman was in command of the mill at Dartmouth. He had worked in his lumber industry in Exeter, New Hampshire. He had distinguished himself as Colonel Samuel Moore's regiment in the siege of Louisbourg in 1745, where he engineered moving the British cannons across boggy terrain. Sir William Pepperell referred to Gilman as very serviceable in the expedition. He returned various times to New Hampshire, but died in Nova Scotia in 1755. The raid. This is John George Pike. He is the only survivor of the raid in Dartmouth in 1751. We'll get to him later. The raid. On September 30th, 1749, about 40 Mi'kmaq attacked 6 men who were in Dartmouth cutting trees. The Mi'kmaq killed 4 of them on the spot, took 1 prisoner, and 1 escaped. 2 of the men were scalped, and the heads of the others were cut off. The attack was on the sawmill at Dartmouth Cove, mill location, which was under the command of Major Ezekiel Gilman. A detachment of Rangers was sent after the raiding party and cut off the heads of 2 Mi'kmaq and scalped 1. Consequences. We already had a look at Major Gilman's sawmill. On October 2nd, 1749, to stop the attacks on the immigrants, Governor Edward Cornwallis created an extirpation proclamation directing all officers, civil and military, and all His Majesty's subjects or others to annoy, distress, take, or destroy the savage commonly called Mi'kmaq wherever they are found. As part of the proclamation, he offered a bounty for the capture of scalps from Mi'kmaq men and for the capture of women and children. not for the scalping of women and children, because this order was only towards the patrol, the fighting group that attacked Dartmouth and Halifax many times. He did not point this at the Mi'kmaq settlements. He was only talking about the fighting patrols. Okay, then it goes on. He offered bounty for the capture of scalps of Mi'kmaq men, as he said. Every Indian you shall destroy upon proclaiming his scalp, as custom is, or every Indian taken, man, woman, or child. This is a misquote, and once again, it only refers to the people who attacked and scalped the British settlers, the British and Scottish settlers. The three companies scoured the land around Halifax looking for Mi'kmaq. However, the Rangers never made contact with any Mi'kmaq. The reason was there were no Mi'kmaq. The area around Halifax and Dartmouth was plague land because of the outbreak of cholera or typhus or smallpox during the Duc d'Anville's expedition in 1747. No Mi'kmaq or Acadian would live in that area anyway. Cornwallis also stationed 30 men guarding the sawmill over the following winter with 2 armed vessels. Gilman left unannounced to New England by April 1750. By July, Cornwallis had given the sawmill to Clapham to manage. In September, he gave command of Gilman's Rangers to Captain Francis Bartello. In March 1750, the Mi'kmaq and Acadian militias killed Cornwallis' messenger, who was en route from Halifax to Chignecto. As a result, Cornwallis stopped sending small parties out of Halifax. Now, on to the raid of Dartmouth in 1751. So it wasn't just a one-off. This is, again, John George Pike, who is the only survivor of the raid on Dartmouth in 1751. May 13th, 1751. The belligerents were the Mi'kmaq and Acadian militias and a very few number of British settlers and few soldiers. Commanders are Joseph Broussard, and he had a 60 to 80 Acadian and Mi'kmaq fighting patrol, and against him were only 60 British regulars and rangers. The casualties were Cornwallis lost 4 men and 6 prisoners. Wilson's Journal said 15 killed. Salisbury Journal said 20 killed. London Magazine said 8 settlers and a few officers killed and 14 prisoners. The Acadians claimed that they only, according to Cornwallis, he said, there were 6 Mi'kmaq killed. And Salisbury said 1 or 2 Mi'kmaq. The raid on Dartmouth, also referred to as the Dartmouth Massacre, occurred during Father Loutre's War on May 13, 1751, when a Mi'kmaq and Acadian militia from Chignecto, under the command of Acadian Joseph Broussard, raided Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, destroying the town and killing 20 British villagers and wounding British regulars. The town was protected by a blockhouse on Blockhouse Hill, close to the corner of King Street and North Street, with William Clapham's Rangers and British regulars from the 45th Regiment of Foot. This raid was one of 7 Mi'kmaq and Acadians would conduct against the town during the war. Here is a picture of the Halifax and Dartmouth area during this war. Here are the forts. The blockhouse we're referring to is here. And here is Fort Duncan, also known as the Horseman's Fort. So the blockhouse is overlooking the Dartmouth Cove. Again, this war began when Edward Cornwallis arrived to establish Halifax with 13 transports on June 21st, 1749. By the time Cornwallis had arrived in Halifax, there was a long history of the Wabanaki Confederacy, which included the Mi'kmaq defending themselves. No, they weren't. They were attacking. from British encroachment and invasion along the New England Acadian border in Maine, and there were many campaigns. The British quickly began to build other settlements. To guard against Mi'kmaq, Acadian, and French attacks on the new Protestant settlements, British fortifications were erected in Halifax, once again Citadel Hill, here, Bedford, Sackville, Dartmouth, and Lunenburg, and Lawrencetown. There were numerous Mi'kmaq and Acadian raids on these villages, as the raid on Dartmouth in 1751. Again, if you're looking for Fort Sackville, you could go towards the Sunnyside Mall here in Bedford and cross over to the water where the river comes in. It's on a small hill overlooking the mouth of the river. Here is once again an image of the original blockhouse, one of the original blockhouses in Lunenburg. Here is where Lawrencetown is. As you go down the coast, it's in Cole Harbor. So there was a raid on those in the Dartmouth area in 1749. In response to the raid, Governor Edward Cornwallis issued the extirpation proclamation, as we already spoke about. In June 1750, the Mi'kmaq killed and scalped 7 men who were at work in Dartmouth. In August 1750, 353 people arrived on the ship Alderney and began the town of Dartmouth. The town was laid out in the autumn of that year. The following month, on September 30th, 1750, Dartmouth was attacked again by the Mi'kmaq, and 5 more residents were killed. In October 1750, a group of about 8 men went out to take their diversion, as if they were fouling. They were attacked by the Indians, who took the whole prisoners, scalped one with a large knife, which they wear for that purpose. Once again, steel knives were supplied since Father Rails wore, and threw him into the sea. In March 1751, the Mi'kmaq attacked on 2 more occasions, bringing the total number of raids to 6 in the previous 2 years. Three months later, on May 13, 1751, before sunrise, Joseph Broussard led 60 Mi'kmaq and Acadians to attack Dartmouth again, in what would be known as the Dartmouth Massacre. The raiding party came down the Shubenacadie River from Chignecto. They came down the Shubenacadie River. Broussard and the others killed 20 settlers, and more were taken prisoner. Captain William Clapham and 60 soldiers of Hugh Warburton's regiment were on duty and fired from the blockhouse, which was located at the point overlooking Dartmouth Cove. The raiding party tortured and mutilated the sergeant and wounded 3 other soldiers. Captain Alexander Murray, along with 40 soldiers, left Halifax in 3 vessels and tried to track them down for miles, but most of the raiding party had dispersed. The British reported that they had killed 6 Mi'kmaq warriors, but were only able to retrieve 1 scalp that they took to Halifax. Remember, the extirpation order was only against these fighting patrols. And of all of that speaking and smearing of Cornwallis in the Canadian news in the last few years, it only resulted in 1 scalp, and it was of one of the scalpers. That particular raiding party had scalped 20 people. Father Le Loutre paid for 18 scalps. That fighting patrol caught only 2 of these Mi'kmaq and only scalped 1. What happened to the missing 2 scalps? Obviously, the guy who got scalped was carrying scalps. The Mi'kmaq scalped all the settlers. The British took what they remained of the bodies to Halifax for burial in the old burying ground. As again, John George Pike survived the raid, but his father, John Abraham, did not. The aftermath. Here, once again, is Captain Alexander Murray. The British retaliated by sending several armed companies to Chignecto, Chignecto being where Truro is. A few French defenders were killed and the dikes were breached. Hundreds of acres of crops were ruined, which was disastrous for the Acadians and French troops. Much more disastrous for the English settlers. Immediately after the raid, a wooden palisade was erected around the town plot. A court-martial was called on 14th May, the day after the raid, to inquire into the conduct of the commanding officers who allowed the town to be destroyed. In June, Clapham Sergeant was acquitted. Mi'kmaq and Acadian attacks continued throughout the French and Indian War. French and Indian War was not only here on the American and Ontario escarpment, but a lot happened here, which ended 14 years after Dartmouth was first settled. For example, in the spring of 1759, there was another attack on Fort Clarence, which is the other side of Dartmouth, in which 5 soldiers were killed. After the initial raid, no new settlers were placed in Dartmouth again for the next 30 years. Of the 383 settlers who arrived in Dartmouth on the Alderney in August 1750, only half remained 2 years later. By the end of the war, 1763, Dartmouth was only left with 78 settlers. Similar raids happened in response to the British founding of Lawrencetown and Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, such as the raid on Lunenburg in 1756. Family trying to save themselves from attack. The Payette family, the French Protestants, being kidnapped. More information on the raid of Lunenburg, which was in May 8th, 1756. And another point of interest is Joseph Howe lived in Dartmouth and was well acquainted with its history. He included the Mi'kmaq raid on one British dwelling in his poem, Acadia. Again, a bit about Cornwallis's proclamation. On October 1st, 1749, Cornwallis convened a meeting of the Nova Scotia Council aboard HMS Beaufort, and according to the minutes, in keeping with the earlier treaties, the Council determined that they would treat the Mi'kmaq as rebellious British subjects rather than as war adversaries, which they were, because since 1713, mainland Nova Scotia was part of the British colonies. Okay? That, in their opinion, to declare war formally against the Mi'kmaq Indians would be in a manner to own them a free and independent people, whereas they ought to be treated as so many bandit ruffians or rebels to His Majesty's government. Controversy. Mi'kmaq historian Daniel N. Paul, not much of a historian, he's more like a fantasist, has disputed British accounts of the raid. Paul dismisses the possibility that Mi'kmaq people would attack unarmed civilians. Oh, yes, they would, obviously. That was their entire history for at least 50 years. Instead, the woodcutters were probably armed and better equipped compared to the Mi'kmaq raiders. This is a blatant lie. The woodcutters had no weapons. They were cutting wood, unless you count their axes. In Father Rail's long box, which was captured at the end of Father Rail's War in 1726, it showed documents proving that the Mi'kmaq were well supplied with the best weapons possible, not only with muskets with good flints, but also steel hatchets and steel knives. They were far better equipped than any settler trying to cut wood with an axe. Paul provides no historical evidence to support his speculations. In his book, We Were Not the Savage, Paul writes this silliness. The question that poses is, why was the group of defenseless Englishmen sent out into the forest alone to cut wood during a time of war without troop protection and thus left vulnerable to attack? That's silly. They were building a new town. If this was the case, then it smacks of gross incompetence on a British officer's part. Not necessarily. If the story is true and not propaganda, a more credible reason for them being sent out without troop protection is that we were not defenseless, but as well armed as the Mi'kmaq, and probably more so, which is a blatant lie. This can be reasonably assumed because, as woodcutters, they had axes to cut wood with, which alone would have made them possessors of weapons as lethally effective and probably more reliable than most of the arms the Mi'kmaq had access to. In any event, because the English were assaulting the Mi'kmaq and stealing their territory, Cornwallis and his council should not have been so affronted and reacted so barbarously when, on October 2nd, 1749, the Nova Scotia Council issued the extirpation order. This is ridiculous. Once again, a musket is far better weapon than an axe. And no, the Mi'kmaq were not running around with stone axes. They had steel axes supplied by Father Rail, at least since 1726. The Siege of Grand Pre. 2 months later, on November 27, 1749, 300 Mi'kmaq, Malecite, and Acadians attacked Fort Vaux-Logis. Once again, Fort Vaux-Logis is here at Grand Pre. When you go towards the Grand Pre St. Charles Church, on a hill just before then, you can take a road down to Horton Landing. And Fort Vaux-Logis is at the bend of the road above the landing. Here is what a 40th Regiment of Foot soldier would have looked like. There were roughly 64 to 72 soldiers in the fort at the time. So this fort was recently established by the British in the Acadian community of Grand Pre. The fort was under the command of Captain Handfield. The native and Acadian militia killed the sentries, the guards, who were firing on them, and the natives then captured Lieutenant John Hamilton and 18 soldiers under his command. Now, with a garrison of only 64 to 78, that significantly reduces the number of soldiers to maybe only 50 versus 300 while surveying the fort's environs. They were out controlling the area. After the British soldiers were captured, the native and Acadian militias made several attempts over the next week to lay siege to the fort before breaking off the engagement. Gorham's Rangers was sent to relieve the fort. When they arrived, the militia had already departed with the prisoners. The prisoners spent several years in captivity before being ransomed. There was no fighting over the winter months, which is common in frontier warfare. The battle at St. Croix. Here. The battle on Battle Hill in St. Croix from March 20th to 23rd, 1750. The commanders and leaders on the French side, it says unknown, but we know it was Broussard. And on the other side was John Gorham and William Clapton, Captain Clackham, and Captain St. Lo. The following spring, on March 18th, 1750, John Gorham and his Rangers left Fort Sackville, at present-day Bedford, Nova Scotia, under orders from Governor Cornwallis to march to Pisiquid, which is present-day Windsor, Nova Scotia. Gorham's mission was to establish a blockhouse at Pisiquid, which became Fort Edward, and to seize the property of Acadians who had participated in the siege of Grand Pre. Once again, at this time, the British and English soldiers were all pointed towards only the soldiers, the Acadians and Mi'kmaq, who were attacking them, not the civilians. Arriving at about noon on March 20th at the Acadian village of 5 houses beside the St. Croix River, Gorham and his men found all the houses deserted. Seeing a group of Mi'kmaq hiding in the bushes on the opposite shore, the Rangers opened fire. The skirmish deteriorated into a siege, with Gorham's men taking refuge in a sawmill and 2 of the houses. During the fighting, the Rangers suffered 3 wounded, including Gorham, who sustained a buff bullet in the thigh. As the fighting intensified, a request was sent back to Fort Sackville for reinforcements. Responding to the call for assistance on March 22nd, Governor Cornwallis ordered Captain Clapham's and Captain St. Lo's regiments, equipped with 2 field guns, to join Gorham at Pisiquid. The additional troops and artillery turned the tide for Gorham and forced the Mi'kmaq to withdraw. Gorham proceeded to present-day Windsor and forced Acadians to dismantle their church, Notre Dame de l'Assomption, so that Fort Edward could be built in its place. The battles at Chignecto. In May 1750, Lawrence was unsuccessful in establishing himself in Chignecto because Le Loutre burned the village of Beaubassin. Chignecto, once again, is around where Fort Beausejour would eventually become, thereby preventing Lawrence from using the supplies of the village to establish a fort. According to historian Frank Patterson, the Acadians at Cobequid burned their homes as they retreated from the British to Tatamagouche, Nova Scotia, in 1754. Lawrence retreated only to return in September 1750. On September 3, 1750, New England Ranger John Gorham led over 700 men to the Isthmus of Chignecto. Mi'kmaq and Acadians opposed the landing and killed 20 British. Several Mi'kmaq were killed, and they were eventually overwhelmed by the invading force and withdrew, burning their crops and houses as they retreated. On 15 October, a group of Mi'kmaq, disguised as French officers, called a member of the Nova Scotia Council, Edward Hull, to a conference. This trap, organized by Chief Etienne Battiard, a Mi'kmaq, gave him the opportunity to wound Howe seriously. He hit him with an axe, and Howe died 5 or 6 days later. According to Captain Lavalier, probably Louis Leneuve de Lavalier, the only eyewitness. Essentially, they lied about their flag of truce, wore French officers' jackets, and this fellow, Etienne Batard, struck a British officer of the British Council with an axe. Le Loutre and Acadian militia leader Joseph Broussard resisted the British assault. The British defeated them and subsequently began construction of Fort Lawrence near the site of the ruined Acadian village of Beaubassin. The work on the fort proceeded rapidly, and the facility was completed within weeks. To limit the British to peninsular Nova Scotia, the French began also to fortify the Chignecto and its approaches, constructing Fort Beausejour and 2 satellite forts, one at present-day Strait Shores, New Brunswick, Fort Gaspereau, which is now near the ferry terminal, and the other at present-day St. John, New Brunswick, at Fort Menagouche. During these months, 35 Mi'kmaq and Acadians ambushed Ranger Francis Bartello, killing him and 6 of his men while taking 7 others captive. The captives included blood-curdling screams as the Mi'kmaq tortured them throughout the night, had a chilling effect on the New Englanders. So they were being tortured all night. Raids on Halifax. There were 4 raids on Halifax during the war. The first raid happened in October 1750. While in the woods on peninsular Halifax, Mi'kmaq scalped 2 British people and took 6 prisoners. Cornwallis's gardener, his son, and Captain William Clapham's bookkeeper were tortured and scalped. The Mi'kmaq buried the son while the gardener's body was left behind, and the other 6 persons were taken prisoner to Grand Pre for 5 months, once again proving that Grand Pre was not a peaceful place. Shortly after this raid, Cornwallis learned that the Mi'kmaq had received payment from the French at Chignecto for 5 prisoners taken at Halifax, as well as prisoners taken earlier at Dartmouth and at Grand Pre. In 1751, there were 2 attacks on the blockhouses surrounding Halifax. Mi'kmaq attacked the North Blockhouse, located at the northern end of Joseph Howe Drive, and killed the men on guard. Mi'kmaq also attacked near the South Blockhouse, located on the south end of Joseph Howe Drive, and at the sawmill at a stream flowing out of Chocolate Lake into the northwest arm. They killed 2 men. Okay, again, the attacks on the blockhouses surrounding Halifax. The Mi'kmaq attacked near the South Blockhouse, which would mean South Street. As we're looking here, that would be on this side, the South Blockhouse. which is located at the southern end of the sawmill, and the North Blockhouse. The North Blockhouse would be here, here, and here. So they moved around both sides of either side of Halifax. The Battle of Baie Verte. In August 1750, there was a naval battle off Baie Verte between British Captain Lecrasse of the Trial and the French sloop London of 70 tons. The London was seized to discover that it had been employed to carry stores of all kinds, arms, and ammunition from Quebec to Le Loutre and the Mi'kmaq fighters, which was a regular thing that was happening. Francois Bigot, the intendant of New France, had given instructions to the French captain to follow the orders of Le Loutre at La Corne. The bills of lading, endorsed by Le Loutre, and other papers and letters were found on board of her, with 4 deserters from Cornwallis's regiment and a family of Acadians. The prize and her papers were sent to Halifax. Port Joli. About 1750, the Mi'kmaq captured a New England fishing schooner off Port Joli and tortured the crew members. To the west of St. Catharines River, the Mi'kmaq heated Durham Rock and forced each crew member to burn on the rock or jump to their death into the ocean. Port Joli. About 1750, the Mi'kmaq captured a New England fishing schooner off Port Joli and tortured the crew members. To the west of the St. Catharines River, the Mi'kmaq heated Durham Rock and forced each crew member to burn or jump to the quay. So, Battle of Port Latour, 1750. This is where Port Latour is. Port Latour is down here in the bottom corner of Nova Scotia. This is a historic marker for Fort Boishebert, which was at that area. Although British forces failed to intercept supplies headed to the fort in October 1750, Cornwallis gained further evidence that the French Governor General of the Canadas was providing the Mi'kmaq with weapons. In mid-September 1750, French officer Louis du Chambon de Vergor, later the commander of Fort Beauséjour, was dispatched aboard the brigantine Saint Francois to convoy the schooner Amiable Jeanne, which was carrying munitions and supplies from Quebec to the St. John River for Boishebert, this guy, Charles Deschamps de Boishebert de Rafiteau, at Fort Boishebert. Early on 16th October, about 10 leagues west of Cape Sable, which is present-day Port Latour. Cape Sable and Cape Sable Island are different. Sable Island is way out here. Cape Sable is down here at the bottom near Port Latour. So Cape Sable, present-day Port Latour, Nova Scotia, and area. British Captain John Roos, in his HMS Albany, overtook the French vessels. Despite inferior armament, Vergor engaged the sloop, allowing the Amiable Jeanne to reach Fort Boishebert. The action lasted the better part of the day, after which, with only 7 men fit out of 50, and Saint Francois unmasted and sinking, Vergor was obliged to yield. 3 of Roos' crew were killed. The French ship contained a large quantity of provisions, uniforms, and warlike supplies. Cornwallis noted that this action was the second time he had caught the Governor of Canada sending a ship of military supplies to the Mi'kmaq to use against the British, once again showing that Daniel Paul is a fantasist. By the end of the year, Cornwallis estimated that there were no less than 8 to 10 French vessels which unloaded war supplies for the Mi'kmaq, French, and Acadians at St. John River and Baie Verte. In response to their defeat in the Battle off Port Latour, the Governor of Canada ordered 4 British sloops to be seized at Louisbourg. The raid on Chignecto. The British retaliated for the raid on Dartmouth by sending several armed companies to Chignecto. A few French defenders were killed, and the dikes were breached. Hundreds of acres of crops were ruined, which was disastrous for the Acadians and the French troops. In the summer of 1752, Father Le Loutre went to Quebec and then on to France to advocate for supplies to rebuild the dikes. He returned in the spring of 1753. 1752 to 1753. In 1752, the Mi'kmaq attacks on the British along the coast, both east and west of Halifax, were frequent. Those who were engaged in the fisheries were compelled to stay on land because they were the primary targets. In early July, New Englanders killed and scalped 2 Mi'kmaq girls and 1 boy off the coast of Cape Sable, Port Latour, Nova Scotia. Now, this is questionable. Here is a marker at Port Latour for Fort Latour, the fort that was there. In August, St. Peter's, Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq seized 2 schooners, the Friendship from Halifax and the Dolphin from England, along with 21 prisoners who were captured and ransomed. By the summer of 1752, the war had not been going well for the British. The Acadian exodus remained strong, and the expulsion order would happen later. The war had bankrupted the colony, as well as 2 of the 3 ranger leaders had died. In August 1761, the main ranger, John Gorham, left for London and had died there of disease in December. Ranger leader Captain Francis Bartello had been killed in action at Chignecto, while the other ranger leader, Captain William Clapham, had been disgraced, failing to prevent the Dartmouth massacre. John Gorham was succeeded by his younger brother, Joseph Gorham. In 1752, to reduce the expense of the war, the companies raised in 1749 were disbanded, bringing down the strength of the unit to only 1 company. That's about 60 to 70 guys. This reduction led to the 22nd March 1753 resolution for a militia that would be raised from the colonists to establish the security of the colony, in which all British subjects between the ages of 16 and 60 were compelled to serve. On April 21st, 1753, at Torbay, the Mi'kmaq fighters killed 2 British. Throughout 1753, French authorities on Cape Breton Island were paying Mi'kmaq warriors for British scalps. In June 1753, the London Magazine reported that the war with the Indians hath hitherto hindered the inhabitants going far into the woods. So the idea of Cornwallis's extirpation order having anything more to do with anybody other than the attacking patrols is ridiculous. On 14th September 1752, Governor Peregrine Hobson and the Nova Scotia Council retreated the Treaty of 1752 with Jean-Baptiste Cope, which I don't have a picture of, but this is Cope's burial site in Point Pleasant Park near Chain Rock Battery near Halifax. The treaty was signed officially on November 22nd, 1752. Cope was unsuccessful in getting support for the treaty from other Mi'kmaq leaders. Here is a monument to the Treaty of 1752. This treaty is well celebrated by the Mi'kmaq, but Cope and the other leaders had violated and tore it up only 6 months later after signing it, meaning the treaty wasn't worth anything. Cope burned the treaty 6 months after he signed it. Despite the collapse of peace on the Eastern Shore, the British did not formally renounce the Treaty of 1752 until 1756. The attack on Mokadom. On February 21st, 1753, 9 Mi'kmaq from Nartigoonich, which is present-day Antigonish, Nova Scotia, in canoes, attacked a British vessel on Country Harbour. The vessel was from Canso and had a crew of 4. The Mi'kmaq fired on them and drove them toward the shore. Other natives joined in and boarded the schooner, forcing them to run their vessel into an inlet. The Mi'kmaq killed and scalped 2 of the British crewmen and took 2 others captive. After 7 weeks in captivity, on April 8th, the 2 British prisoners, one of which was John Connor, killed 6 Mi'kmaq and managed to escape. The attack on Jador. In response, on the night of May 19th, under the leadership of Chief Jean-Baptiste Cope, and the Mi'kmaq attacked on another British schooner in a battle at sea off Jeudor, Nova Scotia. On board were 9 British men and 1 Acadian, Castile, who was the pilot. The Mi'kmaq killed and scalped the British men and let Castile off at Port Toulouse, he's French, where the Mi'kmaq sank the schooner after looting it. In August 1752, the Mi'kmaq at St. Peter's seized the schooners Friendship of Halifax and Dolphin of New England and took 21 prisoners, who they held for ransom. In May 1753, natives scalped 2 British soldiers at Fort Lawrence. Raid on Halifax. In late September 1752, Mi'kmaq scalped a man who they had caught outside the palisade at Fort Sackville. In 1753, when Lawrence became governor, the Mi'kmaq attacked again upon the sawmills near the South Blockhouse on the northwest arm, where they killed 3 British. The Mi'kmaq made 3 attempts to retrieve the bodies for their scalps. On the other side of the harbor in Dartmouth, in 1753, there were reported only to be 5 families, all of whom refused to farm for fear of being attacked if they left the confines of the picketed fence around the village. On 23 July 1753, Governor Hobson reported to the Board of Trade on the continual war we have had with the Indians. Governor Hobson, in his letter to the Board of Trade, dated 1 October 1753, says, "At Dartmouth, there is a small town well picketed in and a detachment of troops to protect it, but there are not above 5 families residing in it, as there is no trade or fishing to maintain any inhabitants, and they apprehend danger from the Indians in cultivating any land on the other side of the pickets." The Lunenburg Rebellion. In the spring of 1753, it became public knowledge that the British were planning to unilaterally establish the settlement of Lunenburg, that is, without negotiating with the Mi'kmaq people. The British decision was a continuation of violations of an earlier treaty and an undermined Chief Jean-Baptiste Cope's 1752 peace treaty. This is, once again, quite twisted because, obviously, the treaty was already burned by this time. As a result, Governor Peregrine Hobson received warnings from Fort Edward that as many as 300 natives nearby were prepared to oppose the settlement of Lunenburg and intended to attack upon the arrival of settlers. The move was part of British government campaign to establish Protestants in Nova Scotia against the power of Catholic Acadians. This also served the dual purpose of getting rid of foreign Protestants from Halifax that had become problematic out of their frustration due to perceived mistreatment by the British. In June 1753, 1,400 German and French Protestant settlers, supervised by Lawrence and protected by the British Navy ships, a unit of regular soldiers under Major Patrick Sutherland, and a unit of rangers under Joseph Gorham, established the village of Lunenburg. The settlement was founded by 2 British Army officers, John Creighton and Patrick Sutherland, and German immigrant local official Dietlib Christopher Jessen. In August 1753, Le Loutre paid Mi'kmaq for 18 British scalps, which they took from the English in different incursions that they had made on their establishments over the summer. Lots of scalps there. Once again, the British only ever took 1 scalp. In December 1753, the British dispatched Robert Monckton, this guy, to quell the Hoffman insurrection. The British feared that the French and the British German Protestant rebels might have joined the Acadians. In mid-September 1753, within 6 months of their arrival at Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, the new settlers, who were mostly foreign Protestants and weary from the resettlement and poor conditions, rebelled against the British. They were supported by Le Loutre. The rebellion is often referred to as the Hoffman Insurrection because it was led by John Hoffman, one of the army captains who had established the settlers in the town. Hoffman led a mob that eventually locked up in one of the blockhouses the Justice of the Peace and some of the commander's Patrick Sutherland's troops. The rebels then declared a republic. Commander Patrick Sutherland at Lunenburg asked for reinforcements from Halifax, and Lawrence sent Colonel Robert Monckton, this guy again, with troops to restore order. Monckton arrested Hoffman and took him to Halifax. Once again, here's Halifax and the founding of Halifax. Hoffman was charged with planning to join the French and take a large number of settlers with him. He was fined and imprisoned on George's Island, Nova Scotia, for 2 years. After the rebellion, a number of the French and German-speaking foreign Protestants left the village to join Le Loutre and the Acadians. Lawrence and his deputy refused to send Acadians to the area for fear of their influence on the local population. Diking on Rivière au Lac. Le Loutre and the Acadian refugees at Chignecto struggled to create dikes that would support the new communities that resulted from the Acadian exodus. In the first winter, 1749, the Acadians survived on rations, waiting for the dikes to be built. Acadians from Minas were a constant support in providing provisions and labor on the dikes. In retaliation for the Acadian and Mi'kmaq raid on Dartmouth in 1751, the British raided Chignecto, destroying the dikes and ruining hundreds of acres of crops. Dikes for lives? That's not a very good trade. Acadians began to defect from the exodus and made application to return to the British colony. Le Loutre immediately sought help from Quebec and then France to support the rebuilding dikes in the area. He returned with success in May 1753, and work began on the grand diking project on Rivière au Lac, which is present-day Au Lac River in New Brunswick. At this time, there were 2,000 Acadians and about 300 Mi'kmaq encamped nearby. By the summer of 1754, Le Loutre's amazing engineering feats manifested themselves on the great sweeping marshlands of the Isthmus. He now had in his workforce, and within a 48-hour marching radius, about 1,400 to 1,500 Acadian men. Nearby at Baie Verte, there was a summer encampment of about 400 natives that would have been one of the largest concentrations of native people in the Atlantic region at the time. Although altogether he had a substantial fighting force capable of defending itself against anything the Nova Scotia government might have mustered at the time. That year, storm tides broke through the main cross dike of the large-scale reclamation project, destroying nearly everything the Acadians had accomplished in several months of intense work. Again, some Acadians tried to defect to the British. But that time, it was a storm, not the British. 1754-1755, the raid on Lawrencetown. In 1754, the British established Lawrencetown. In late April 1754, Beausoleil, that's Joseph Broussard again, and a large band of Mi'kmaq and Acadians left Chignecto, the Truro area, for Lawrencetown. They arrived in mid-May and in the night opened fire on the village. Beausoleil killed and scalped 4 British settlers and 2 soldiers. By August, as the raids continued, the residents and soldiers were withdrawn to Halifax. By June 1757, the settlers who had to be withdrawn completely again from the settlement of Lawrencetown because the number of native raids eventually prevented settlers from leaving their houses. There's so many attacks, they stopped counting. So here, the Acadians actually succeeded in destroying an English settlement. Prominent Halifax business person Michael Franklin was captured by a Mi'kmaq raiding party in 1754 and held captive for 3 months. Another captivity narrative was written by Henry Grace, was taken captive by the Mi'kmaq near Fort Cumberland, which was Fort Beausejour, in 1750s. The narrative was entitled A History of the Life and Sufferings of Henry Grace, Boston, 1764. Port Joli. In 1754, late one evening, a canoe full of Mi'kmaq fighters arrived to destroy the rudder of New England fishing vessel. The New England crew sank the canoe, and all the Mi'kmaq drowned except for Molly Pigto, who was captured and taken back to New England. Battle of Fort Le Loutre. Here is the capture of the French naval ships Alcide and Lys, carrying supplies for the Acadian and Mi'kmaq militias. The battle was a contributing factor to the resumption of formal war between the British and French. In April 1755, while searching for a wrecked vessel at Port Latour, Cobb discovered the French schooner Marguerite taking war supplies to the St. John River for Boishebert at Fort Menagouche, St. John. Cobb returned to Halifax with the news and was ordered by Governor Charles Lawrence to blockade the harbor until Captain William Kensey arrived in the warship HMS Vulture, and then to assist Kensey in capturing the French prize and taking it to Halifax. In the action of 8th June 1755, a naval battle off Cape Race, Newfoundland, the British found on board the French ships Alcide and Lise 10,000 scalping knives for Acadians and Indians serving under Micmac chief Cope and Acadian Beausoleil as they continued to fight Father Le Loutre's war, once again proving Daniel Paul's book to be fantasy. The British also thwarted French supplies from reaching Acadians in Mi'kmaq, resisting the British in the previous war, King George's War. And that would be the first Battle of Cape Finisterre in 1747. The Battle of Fort Beausejour. Once again, this is in the 7 Years' War. In May 22nd, 1755, the British commanded a fleet of 3 warships and 33 transports carrying 2,100 soldiers from Boston, Massachusetts. They landed at Fort Lawrence on June 3rd, 1755. The following day, the British forces attacked Fort Beausejour using the plan created by spy Thomas Pichon. After the fort's capitulation, the French forces evacuated on June 16th, 1755 to Fort Gaspereau en route to Louisbourg, arriving on June 24th, 1755. Shortly after, Monckton dispatched Captain John Roos to take Fort Menagouche, St. John, at the mouth of the St. John River. Boishebert, seeing that resistance was futile, destroyed the fort and retreated upriver to Belle Isle Bay. There he erected a camp volant and constructed a small battery as a rearguard for the Acadian settlements on the river, which the French destroyed themselves to prevent it from falling into British hands. This battle proved to be one of the key victories for the British in the 7 Years' War, which is what we were looking at before, in which Great Britain gained control of nearly all of New France. Trade during the war. During Father Le Loutre's war, Minas Basin communities willingly responded to the call from Le Loutre for basic foodstuffs, the breadbasket of the region. They raised wheat and other grains, produced flour in no fewer than 11 mills, and sustained herds of several thousand head of cattle, sheep, and hogs. Regular cattle droves made their way over a road from Cobequid to Tatamagouche for the supply of Beausejour, Louisbourg, and settlements on Ile Saint-Jean, Prince Edward Island. Other exports went by sea from Minas Basin to Beaubassin or to the mouth of the St. John River, carried in Acadian vessels by Acadian middlemen. At the same time, Acadians began to refuse to trade with the British. By 1754, no Acadian produce was reaching the Halifax market. While the French pressured Acadians not to trade with Halifax, even when British merchants tried to buy directly from Acadians, they were refused. Acadians refused to supply Fort Edward with any firewood, and Lawrence passed a corn law forbidding Acadian exports until Halifax market had been supplied. The British devised a war plan for Nova Scotia that focused on cutting off the food supply to Fort Beausejour and Louisbourg. This plan involved both siege tactics and also the cutting off the source of supply. Father Le Loutre's war had done much to create the condition of total war. British civilians had not been spared, and as Lawrence saw it, Acadian civilians had provided intelligence, sanctuary, and logistical support, while others actually fought in armed conflict. More than any other single factor, including the massive assault that eventually forced the surrender of Louisbourg, the supply problem spelled doom to French power in the region. To cut off the supply to the French, Lawrence realized he could do this, in part, by deporting the Acadians. With the fall of Beausejour, Le Loutre was imprisoned, and the Acadian expulsion began. During the French and Indian War, the British forces rounded up French settlers, starting with the Bay of Fundy campaign in 1755. The British deported the Acadians and burned the villages at Chignecto to prevent their return. Here is information about the expulsion. This is St. John River Campaign, which is the blue view of the plundering and burning of the city of Grimrose in 1758. So the expulsion was not just in 1755. It went from August 10, 1755 to July 11, 1764. It was 8 years, 11 months, and 1 day. It was in Acadia, which is mostly Maritimes and northern Maine. And the result was the Siege of Louisbourg and the Halifax Treaties. Here, and here is a famous painting of the expulsion of the Acadians, where it's supposedly sad to see the Acadians go, but remember, they were active belligerents fighting against the British, supplying both the Acadian Fighting Patrol and the Mi'kmaq. The Acadian exodus from Nova Scotia during the war spared most of those who joined it, particularly those who went to Ile Saint-Jean and Ile Royale, from the British expulsion of the Acadians in 1755 to 1764. However, with the fall of Louisbourg in 1758, the Acadians who left for the French colonies were deported as well. This ends the story of Father Le Loutre's War.